Try to take a moment and remember the last time you needed another person to offer you mercy. Perhaps you sinned against this person, committed some transgression. You were in the wrong, it was clear. You were afraid that they might let you know that you were in the wrong. You were afraid that you might feel their frustration, their wrath, their fury, and you needed mercy. And you longed for mercy. Do you remember? Do you remember how that feels? Now take a moment and try to remember the last time you had an opportunity to offer mercy. Someone sinned against you, and it hurt. You felt the pain deeply. They were wrong, and it was obvious. And you felt very justified in letting them know just how much they hurt you. In that moment, did you feel a tension? Knowing this isn't exactly the opportunity to offer mercy, unmerited as it is, undeserved. That's what makes it mercy. But you felt so hurt. Do you remember what it felt like to have that tension inside? James, in the 2nd chapter, is inviting the church to consider how to become a people whose individual lives and whose shared lives are marked by mercy. To do that, he wants them to see themselves as people who are recipients of mercy. And he draws a connection between the mercy received and the ability and urgency, imperative to offer mercy. He understands the tension. He understands our tendencies. But he also understands that if the church is going to be the people God has called us to be, then we have to be the kind of people who embody the mercies of God. So how do we get there? And what does that look like? What does it look like for mercy to triumph amongst the people of God? And for James, for us, whether it's first century Christians, the names of which, like, we don't know their names, or 21st century Christians on the other side of the world, for James, for us, the thing to discover, the thing to embrace is that it's easier to offer mercy when we recognize our need for mercy. Let me say that again. It's easier to offer mercy to someone who has sinned against me when I can remember, and not just remember, but embrace that I need mercy from God. That I need Him to look upon me with kindness even though it's undeserved. It's easier to offer mercy when I remember my need for God's mercy. So how does James offer this to the church? He begins with a contrast between favoritism on the one hand and impartiality on the other. Favoritism, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I'm looking for people who are worthy of my favor, people who can offer me something, and they're going to get my best, and they're going to get my time, and they're going to get my energy. Or impartiality, I'm looking to offer my energy and my best to people who perhaps have nothing to offer. It's not a this for that. It's not, I'm going to give you something and I expect something in return. Impartiality just means I'm not playing favorites. I'm offering my best to people who may not have anything to offer in return. And James fleshes this out in the contrast between the haves and the have-nots. the rich and the poor. And he throws out this hypothetical situation about two people who come into what looks like a worship service. One is dressed in finery and gold rings and jewelry and fancy clothes, and another is dressed in rags. And James says, how will these folks be received when they show up into the service of worship? Verse 3, if you take notice of the one wearing fine clothes and say, here, have a seat, come on down to the front row and have the prized location. That tells you a lot of difference about ancient church and modern church. Nobody wants to sit in the front. For us, the prize seat is way in the back, right, Tommy? Come to the place of honor. Come to the front. Come and sit at the head of the table, whatever it is. Like, you obviously look like an important and influential person, and you are deserving of the honor. And then he sort of says, look on the other side of it. Verse 4, you've made distinctions by telling the poor, stand there or sit at my feet. Can you imagine walking into the gathered worship of the people of God and being asked to sit on the floor? Sit at my feet. And so James holds this out. Like, look at the situation, and you kind of get the feeling that maybe he's offering this over-the-top hypothetical situation to make the point. Now, it's helpful to know that in the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, there were significant, highly stratified social classes. Very few people at the top with tons and tons of wealth, a whole lot of people at subsistence level, like make enough today to put some food on the table, and then a lot of people who just lived in poverty and didn't know where their next meal was coming. It's very much like just a ladder, and it was very difficult, nigh impossible, to move up the ladder. You might get a little advantage in your rung, but getting up the ladder was almost impossible. You might come down the ladder some. You could fall, but getting into the next level almost never happened. So that's what their world looked like. And in a world like that, you're always looking for people who can help you get to your advantage. The Romans called it patronage. And so you might say, well, you know, I'm at this level, and there's somebody at the next level who I think I've got a service I could offer that person, and so I'm going to go to their door and kind of make them an offer, and hopefully it'll be an offer that they won't refuse, and I'll offer them something, and then they'll offer me some of their stature in return, and maybe just by being associated with somebody who's higher up on that ladder than I am, they'll kind of, like, I'll just kind of get pulled along with them. Like, you're not going to get to their level, but association goes a long way, doesn't it? And so that's kind of how the Roman world worked. And so you can imagine if that's the broad cultural thing, where people are constantly looking for a this for that, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, I've got something to offer you, what can you offer me? That you can imagine how easily a cultural expectation could condition the gathering of the church, such that when someone who obviously has something to offer shows up, they get pride of place. And when someone who clearly has nothing to offer shows up, well, just stand over there. And James says when you do that, like, you're creating these distinctions. You're treating people who God has made in his image as worthless. And so the rich receive favor, but the poor are looked upon, and it's just as if they're said, no mercy for you, no favor for you, no privilege, no benefit. Like, just go over there. If you've got nothing in that world, you get trampled. And you might be thinking, well, their world may not be all that different from ours. Because sometimes people get trampled in the 21st century too. And we know what it looks like for people to trade favors. Sometimes politicians get indicted for that sort of thing, right? So maybe our world isn't quite as different as we sometimes think it is from the ancient Roman Empire, where there's constantly this effort to find people who can advantage me. Is this relation, what will I benefit from? What can I get out of it? How can this person help me get the next promotion or get to the next thing? And if I'm so focused on that, am I not focused on embodying the mercies of God to people who can't help me out in those ways? So James understands that those cultural tendencies can sometimes make their way into the life of the church. And he responds in a couple of ways. Number one, he reminds the early church that God has a special place in his heart for the poor. Verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers and sisters. And you get a sense here that this is we talk about truth and love sometimes, like here's a hard thing, but I love you. I'm doing the hard thing because I love you. And you hear James saying, look, hard conversation, but you are my beloved brothers and sisters. Like I care about you and I want to see mercy triumph. But that means we've got to talk about when it doesn't. So verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? And what's he getting at there? He's talking about the reality that when we have a lot of resources, it's easy to trust in our own resources than to trust Jesus. If we have a lot of ingenuity, it's easy to trust in our own intellectual prowess. When we have a good network, it's easy to trust in our network. When we are problem solvers, we can go to the board and try to figure out the solution when what we ought to do is come to the altar and ask the Lord for help. And James is reminding us that the reality is there are folks who have nothing except trust in the Lord, and that God in his wisdom has decided to advance his kingdom through them. And you see this throughout the narrative of Scripture, don't you? I mean, go all the way back to Abraham. Now, Abraham had a lot of resources. He was a wealthy man. But he didn't have anyone to pass all of it on to. And in the ancient world, if you didn't have a son, like when you die, there's no one to carry on your name, you're lost to history. Reputation, renown, any of it. If you don't have a son, like this person is the son of this person, you might as well have never been alive. And so Abraham is lacking, and he doesn't have anyone to make sure he's remembered. He doesn't have anyone to carry on his legacy, and he's sorrowful for this, and his heart is grieved. And even though he's got a household and resources, he has a situation where it will all be lost, and there's nothing he can do about it. Not a thing. And what does God do? God says, well, I think I'm going to pick someone who's helpless. Helpless to save himself, helpless to solve his problem, and I'm going to use his family to save the world. God picks incapable people. God picks people who are lacking. Why? So that his glory and his power and his love and his mercy might be amplified in his works. Abraham's family, given to him as a gift from God, grows. They go down into Egypt seeking relief from a famine. Over the years, they become slaves there. Forced to work, grueling conditions, living in poverty, day after day after day. God rescues them from oppression and brings them out. And he says to them, yesterday you had nothing, You were slaves. You weren't a people. You didn't have a constitution. You didn't have a society. You were just forced under oppressive labor week in, week out. You had no power. You had no resources. You had nothing. Now you belong to me. You were not a people. Now you're my people. You had nothing. Now you have my covenant. You were far from me. Now my presence will dwell in your midst. Did they have, could they say, well, look how swell we are. Look what we offered to God. They have nothing to offer him. Everything he offers is mercy. If he picked Pharaoh to try to save the world or to save the world through, then you might say, well, look, he's powerful. He has resources. He has wealth. He has people at his disposal. He has armies. Where is God in this? So God picks people who have nothing so that his power can be magnified, so that we don't get distracted. Souls. Fast forward to the New Testament. One of the reasons that Jesus was opposed is because he picked the wrong kind of people to hang out with. He picked day laborers and sinners. And the connected people in Jerusalem didn't like it. Because if you think you're the Messiah, obviously you should spend time with the connected people, right? And so again and again and again, God chooses the poor for the advance of his kingdom. And so James says, remember that. When that person in rags shows up in your worship service, God chooses this one for the advance of his kingdom. He also reminds them that in their context, favoritism is counterintuitive. You may have noticed the bit about in verse 6, you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Most Christians in the early church were quite poor. There were a few higher status folks in the churches. So you probably have folks who are sort of saying, well, if we could get a few wealthy people in here, that would really help the project out a lot, wouldn't it? And so James says, but don't you realize, you're trying to play to people who oppress you, drag you into court, take advantage of you? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? And again, it's helpful to have a little context. In the ancient world, guess who ran the court system? Not the poor people. And guess who used it to their advantage? Not the poor people. And guess who assumed that the court system was neutral? The people who ran it. Imagine this scenario. It makes perfect sense. You're a magistrate or a judge of some sort, and a rich man and a poor man come in, and there's a legal conflict. Obviously, the rich guy has all he needs, and he doesn't need anything else. He lives in comfort. He wouldn't take advantage of this poor guy. He doesn't need anything. The poor person, on the other hand, well, they have needs all over the place, and surely they would use the system to their advantage. So the courts assumed that the wealthy in the ancient world didn't really have a motivation for getting involved in the courts because they have what they need. And you're probably thinking, how short-sighted can you possibly be? Because we all know that plenty of people with plenty of resources use systems to take advantage to gain off people who don't have the advantages, who don't know how the system works, who don't have the resources, who don't have the network, who don't have the reputation. Served a church one time in a rural part of Alabama in Bullitt County for 3 years. And when our family moved to Bullitt County, unemployment was at 19%. Tremendous poverty. And the church was in ministry with the poor consistently, regularly. There was one family in particularly, a grandmother, 2 daughters, and several grandchildren who lived in a house together and had the opportunity to be in that home a number of times, and it was like disrepair is an understatement. And they came to me one time and said that one of the daughters had been cooking in the home, and a big chunk of the kitchen ceiling just without warning fell on her head. And they didn't know what to do because they couldn't get it fixed. The landlord lived in Georgia. They'd never seen him. Some guy would show up once a month, demand the rent, and if they didn't pay up, he'd just would threaten to throw their stuff on the curb. And I began to realize there's a guy who lives in another state who won't fix the house and is threatening to just kick people out illegally on the assumption that they won't have anyone to help them. And in most cases, didn't. In this instance, there were some attorneys in the church who were altogether happy to write a letter to the landlord, letting them know that we'll send you the receipts instead of the rent. And it was a lovely opportunity to see the church come along and become an advocate. People who have plenty offering their time to make sure that those who didn't were treated fairly. It was an eye-opening experience to see how the poor could just be taken advantage of with almost no recourse in most instances. And a lovely opportunity to see how the church can step in. And many of you perhaps have felt what it is like to need someone to help. And many of you have been the people who've stepped in to help. One of the reasons that our family wanted to come is because of the partners all over the city of Birmingham, where Christ Church has said, we want to get out there among our neighbors and embody the mercies of God. And one of the exciting things is that it's not just something you've done, but there are folks who are constantly envisioning the future. And it's not just here, it's around the world. The crucial thing is vigilance, isn't it? Like, how do we continue to cultivate a shared life where people don't just get run over and nobody cares? What does it look like to be the people of God who care for and stand up for and advocate for and minister to the folks who easily get run over? James wants the church in the first century to be that kind of place. He wants the church in the 21st century to be that kind of church. So he calls upon the people of God to discover again our need for mercy. That's part of the strategy in the text, isn't it? You see how the poor are treated. You see how those who have nothing are just discarded. Isn't it crucial to remember that all of us, regardless of where we are in life, stand as those who need the mercy of God? And so that's this whole passage about committing this sin and that sin implies and reminds us that we stand before God as transgressors in need of his mercy. Hear the text again. Chapter 1, verse 8. You do well if you really fulfill the royal law. According to Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Quoting his brother, Jesus, James is. He says, but if you show partiality, you commit sin. Now that's striking, because we talk about sin sometimes, don't we? But usually it's the big ones that get our attention. And he's going to get to those: murder, adultery, things like that. When was the last time anyone confessed the sin of partiality? When was the last time anyone even talked about the sin of partiality? But that's exactly what Scripture says in this case. Like, if my only attention is those who if I can get something from you to my benefit, you get my time. If not, James says, that's a sin. He's a name it and claim it kind of guy in that way. He'll name the sin. This is what it is. This is reality. And I think he gets that it's easy to just ignore this sort of thing or rationalize it away. So he talks about other things like murder and adultery, some of the big ones, top 10 sins, right? Those are up there. If you show partiality, you commit sin, this is verse 9, and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Whoever keeps the whole law, but fails in one point, has become accountable for all of it. He's not saying every law is equally severe or every sin is equally severe, because if you read through the Old Testament, you got like some sins that require smaller sacrifices and smaller penalties, and others that require larger sacrifices and are more costly in terms of that and more penalties. So there is a different severity, but he sees the law of God as a unity, and any transgression, even if you avoid the big 10, any transgression means you're a transgressor. Any transgression means we are transgressors, no matter how big or how small it might be. And so James introduces the transgression of partiality. Whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For the one who said, "You shall commit adultery," also said, "You shall not commit murder." That one is God, 10 Commandments, Exodus 20. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. So speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. Speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy, yet mercy triumphs over judgment. So we may read this and feel just beat up. I mean, we can make ourselves feel like we can frame the 10 Commandments in our living room and feel really good about ourselves because we keep them, like those are honestly pretty easy. And then James comes along and says, "Oh yeah, well, what about when you tell the poor guy to sit on the floor?" And his purpose is to invite his recipients, the people who are going to read this, to remember they deserve nothing from God but judgment. No matter who they are, no matter where they are on the social ladder or the socioeconomic ladder, no matter who their family is or where they're from, all of humanity stands before God as transgressors. All of us stand before God as transgressors, sinners. He doesn't owe us any favor. He doesn't owe us any kindness. He doesn't owe us mercy. That's what makes it mercy. He doesn't owe us anything but judgment, condemnation. And yet, he is a God who is committed to the triumph of mercy. And the triumph of mercy is embodied in Jesus. When Jesus came, was born, lived and walked among us, wept alongside us, cared for us, fed us, healed us, and then allowed himself to be given up for us, even though we had sinned against him. He is mercy embodied. He is the unblemished Lamb. He is the one who committed no transgression himself. He's the one who committed no sin. He is the one who is pure in every way. He is the one who has never stumbled or rebelled. He's the only one who deserves anything and everything. He's the only one who deserves glory and honor and prime of place. He is the one who is preeminent in all things. And yet the one who is rightly enthroned above the cosmos, the one who is preeminent in all things, has lowered himself and offered himself to suffering and death. A suffering and death that I deserve. The one who looks at the scriptures and knows that the wages of sin is death, steps into the place of the condemned and takes the wages on himself, though he did not deserve. So that upon his resurrection, he may look at rebels and doubters and faithless ones and say, come. It is I. Gather. Experience the beauty of the mercies of God. The death and resurrection of Jesus is the triumph of mercy in history. And the consequence of it is so that the people of God, the people who Jesus takes to himself, can come to embody his mercy. For the sake of our neighbors, for the sake of the nations. And when we remember, when I remember that I stand in need of his mercy, it's a lot easier to offer that mercy. And when I forget, when I'm not meditating on the mercies of God and giving thanks for the mercies of God, it becomes a lot easier for me to withhold mercy. It becomes a lot easier for me to get consumed with who can do what for me. And so James invites us to remember, like, look, we deserve judgment. We stand before him as convicted transgressors. And yet he's merciful. He's kind. He's good to us. We don't deserve it. It's unmerited. And he's not just a little bit kind. He's over the top kind. He doesn't just sprinkle a little grace our way. He lavishes it upon us. He doesn't just do a bit of mercy over here on Tuesday. It's constant. Mercy upon mercies poured out from God upon us who do not deserve it. Can we not then be the kind of people increasingly who embody the mercies of God? As we recognize our need, our consistent need for divine mercy, we will become the kind of people through whom mercy flows. And the result is the spread of the kingdom and the salvation of the nations. So what does that look like in our lives? It looks like cultivating practices that draw people to Jesus. A year or two ago, I had a book recommended to me by a colleague at a seminary. The title of the book is Bless, written by a couple of guys, they're brothers, John and Dave Ferguson. Some of you may have read it. It's kind of a book on evangelism, but it's a book on evangelism that has integrity. Not kind of a salesmanship thing. It's not just a presentation. It's relationally strong, and it's oriented at cultivating practices that help people get drawn to Jesus. As I was reading through James and thinking about this embodied mercy, I found my thoughts go to the practices that are commended there. And the Fergusons invite us to start praying for who God wants you to offer this kind of mercy to. Like who Who can I bless? Who can I offer myself to for Jesus' sake and for their sake? Maybe it's somebody in the neighborhood. Maybe it's somebody at work. But here I am, and I'm going to spend some time today. Jesus, show me who and show me how. Open the door, create the space for a relationship of kindness and mercy and grace to emerge in this place. And then when they show up to talk, listen, maybe grab a bite to eat or a cup of coffee. You don't have to jump straight into the Jesus has a wonderful plan for your life. They'll think you're trying to sell something. Just be quiet. Let them talk more. That's what these guys commend. It's difficult sometimes, right? Sometimes we're talking and they're talking and we're trying to, like, somebody's got an objection and we're formulating our response and we've had our apologetics course and we're ready. Evangelism. Just be quiet, drink your coffee and listen. It builds credibility and it lets people know you actually care about them. And eventually, as you listen, you'll probably discover a need. A need that Jesus wants you to meet. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a meal. Maybe it's help over the weekend. Maybe it's a shoulder in a time of grief. And as that credibility and relational substance develops, there will be space to tell your story. Here's how Jesus met me when my heart was broken. He can meet you there too. And because you didn't come as a salesperson, but as a person who embodied mercy. It's far more likely that the kindness of God will draw this person and that person to Jesus. So the question for us becomes, will we be people who see ourselves fundamentally as persons in need of mercy? Like, I need his mercy. I don't deserve Jesus' favor. And then when I receive his mercy, can I become a conduit of it to the people around me? And if I can, with God's help, with the power of the Spirit at work in us, we will see the triumph of mercy. The only question is whether we want to be that kind of people, and increasingly so.